So using the term sex work is harmful even if you have good intentions. Here's why. The term sex work gets people thinking about this issue in a capitalist framework that says work is a choice rather than coerced under an exploitative economy. Financial coercion is not considered real coercion. Therefore, sex work is not considered coerced sex, but voluntary sex. This is why their motto is sex work is work. I'm not saying that the capitalist system isn't coercive and exploitative, because very clearly it is. But there is no social configuration wherein work has become obsolete. Even if you are like, I reject all of society and I am going off into the woods, you're still going to have to do work, in the sense of you're going to have to labor to feed yourself. I mean, there's sets of conditions wherein some people don't have to work, but there's no set of conditions in which no one has to work, other than like a far-flung future scenario where machines literally have got everything covered and we're just like pampered, you know, objects that exist to experience like whatever life's pleasures are and very few of its pains unless we want to. And, you know, we just kind of like live the Wall-E existence or something. But until that day, yeah, human labor is necessary for any society, any social or economic configuration. Work is not some inherent property of capitalism. So already wrong. So when it comes to like sex work, work is essentially necessary for a society because there are going to be different needs in a society. And somehow those needs are going to have to be filled, and usually those needs are filled by other human beings. One of the needs that is always going to exist in society is there are going to be men who want to get laid, who maybe are not so good at it. Maybe they don't have the social skills. Maybe they just don't feel like dealing with the hassle. Maybe they're just too busy, or they don't want a relationship. They just want the sexual transaction. There's always going to be men who want sex. There's always going to be women who want sex too, but it's a little bit easier because they can usually get it pretty easily. As long as there is a human need for some sort of low relationship, sexual contact, just like, hey, let's meet, here's sex, here's money, boom. That's always going to exist in any system. Even if you have a system without money, there's still going to be some form of exchange where it's like, I will give you sex in exchange for this. You will give me this in exchange for sex. People are always going to come to that arrangement. Human beings have done these sorts of trades for all of time. And like prostitution in particular is called the world's oldest profession for a reason. I don't know that it actually is. I would assume it's probably a very early profession. I don't know if it's the first profession. But, you know, as long as there are human beings who want sex and there are human beings who are willing to give sex in exchange for something, there is going to be sex work. And it shouldn't be stigmatized. It shouldn't be treated as any different than any other form of trade. The sex work and sex trafficking binary is a false dichotomy popularized by police, prosecutors, and sex trade expansion activists. In reality, the sex trade is a spectrum. It is not a rigid binary between free will and sex trafficking. The binary originated from sexist criminal laws that view prostitutes as agents making bad choices, like how many Westerners see global South countries are poorly led rather than under financial coercion by the IMF and global North. There's two ends of the spectrum when it comes to sex work. There are sex workers who are very much like cognizant of the decision they're making and are not under like any sort of immense coercive pressure. They just want to do this kind of work. And then there are people who are under a tremendous amount of coercive pressure, and it's like are in a desperate situation, and this is the only thing they can think to do to survive. You know, there's always going to be people who are forced into that line of work by circumstances. I don't understand if it's a spectrum, then like surely we can make a differentiation between like instances where a person is doing it of their own volition and instances where there are these coercive elements present, right? But like, if you're going to fucking get into that, then like this goes well beyond sex work, because I hate to tell you guys, but a lot of people out there are doing jobs they fucking hate, right? It's not just sex workers that are doing it. I don't know why their job in particular needs to be singled out for like special examination when there are literally countless people, workers in all fields and industries, that are doing stuff they hate so that they can pay bills and keep the lights on. You know, it's not just sex workers. And that, to me, is why it's so important to call them sex workers. To make the statement, hey, These people are working for a living. Sex worker is about normalizing that that is an industry. That is a job. And in the same way that all other jobs need to be reformed, in the same way that workers need to be empowered, you know, workers of the world unite includes sex workers, right? So if you're a leftist and you believe workers of the world unite, you know, you have nothing to lose but your chains, including sex workers in that is extremely important. Creating them as some other class, some other sort of a form of being that is separate from this coercive work dynamic that exists now, you're basically othering them at that point. And you're putting up a blockade between them and the civil liberties and protections that they desperately need. So to me, this is nothing more than like old-fashioned pearl-clutching prudishness wearing a thin veneer of leftism. Sex work, as it's used by sex trade expansionists, weird terminology, by the way. I don't know that there's anyone doing that other than like pimps, maybe, can only truly describe the tiny fraction of financially secure people in the sex trade. Sex trafficking is a legal construct that can only be used for one, minors, and two, adults who are forced or tricked into to prostitute for another person. The vast majority of people in sex trade meet the legal criteria for sex trafficking, or are selling sex due to some form of financial coercion. And coerced sex is bad, actually. It can cause disassociation, self-loathing, disease, depression, PTSD, drug addiction, and suicide. For each person harmed, our community is never the same. First of all, I mean, you don't cite any sort of actual data on any of this, so we're just taking it at face value, but we really shouldn't. I just don't feel like stopping the stream to go do some research to see like how much of this actually holds up to scrutiny. I suspect probably not much of it. If there's a problem with people who are in desperate financial situations and they have to enter the sex trade to pay bills when they really don't want to do that, they find themselves in the same position as tons of other Americans who do jobs that they also hate, that they don't really want to do, and they're not fairly compensated for. So it seems to me that if you're going to put that out there, then you have to then acknowledge that the problem is not the job. The problem is the poverty that coerces people into doing jobs they don't like or don't want. Like, the problem is that coercive element of either you need to make this money or you die, that needs to be dealt with. And that will solve the problem. Once again, you've decided to isolate sex work from all other work and treat it by a different standard. And the only reason a person would do that, in my opinion, is if they just have a prudish hatred of sex and sex workers. What about the argument that sex work is not a human rights violation because it is consensual? People will consent to anything to survive. Consent and coercion can exist. Coercion voids consent. I mean, that's true. But once again, by your own admission, it's on a gradient. Work or die is not something invented by capitalism. If you're a farmer 1,000 years ago and you decide I am no longer going to till my fields or tend to them or, you know, harvest or anything, that farmer is going to starve to death. He's not going to starve to death because of some human coercive system that's been created. He's going to starve to death because he refuses to do the labor that facilitates his existence. And when you take things into the level of society, there has to be some mechanism to motivate people to work. I agree that the current paradigm is hideous and definitely is in dire need of replacement, but there's always going to be a coercive element at present. So then by that standard, consent just flat out doesn't even exist. That's too postmodern even for my ass. I think the concept of consent has to be allowed to exist somewhere. You've basically defined coercion here as like any external force that pushes you slightly in any direction. Well, that's called life. There's always going to be elements that are acting upon you in this world. So we have to make a distinction about how directly those elements are impacting you and to what extent. I don't think that you can say like a person who's like, I need a job in this economy. Oh, what am I going to do? You know, I am pretty hot. Maybe I could suck dick for a living. I've always liked doing that. I'm gonna make that my fucking job, actually. That sounds cool. If that person wants to do that, like, was that person coerced simply because the whole thing started with a problem of like, need to figure out some way to make money? I don't think so. I think that's pretty far-fetched. By that standard, none of us consent to anything. Like, if you're going to take this, I think if you take this argument to its natural conclusion, you're eventually just going to succumb to this stupid anti-natalism bullshit. And you're just going to fucking sit around moping about how no one asked to be born, like a crybaby. I don't know. This strikes me as like really weak. What about using the term sex work to destigmatize people selling sex themselves? The term sex work is only capable of removing stigma from pimps and sex buyers, not people selling sex. Why? Why? Explain your reasoning. Oh, you are. Okay, sorry. This is because prostituting is seen as a woman's role in a sexist society. All right, so like once again, just basic fact of society here that I guess we're not going to acknowledge. There's a lot more horny, desperate men than there are horny, desperate women. Because a woman, regardless of attractiveness level, can pretty much always find some guy that's going to have sex with her if that's what she really wants. A guy is not always going to have that guarantee. A man is always going to struggle more to get a woman than a woman is going to struggle to get a man. Even if you do like a post-gender society where woman and man are not really these like strongly defined concepts anymore. There's maybe a vague sense of feminine and masculine that's kind of like a holdover. Even in that configuration, I think on some level, it's always going to be easier to get laid if you're a curvy woman with a pussy than if you're a frumpy dude with a dick. You know, whatever words you apply to it, I think that's just always going to be so. It is totally delusional to believe that disrespect against prostitutes will end with a thoroughly misogynistic industry and society. The act of buying sex is an act of misogyny and a callous exploitation of the vulnerability. Then buying a sandwich from that guy that doesn't really want to be working at Subway is the same thing. Going to Walgreens and buying a Arizona tea from a clerk that doesn't want to be there, same thing. Getting in an Uber driven by someone who's only driving Uber because they can't make ends meet otherwise, same thing. Ordering DoorDash, same thing. Should it be addressed? Sure, but it should be addressed systemically because there's nothing special or unique or different about sex work versus any of those other things, other than it skeeves you out more. That's it. Basically, you're basically making an extrapolation based on your own personal feelings of revulsion. You don't like sex work. Therefore, all of these critiques that could be made on a social scale are instead being made to seem as if they apply exclusively to sex work, so you can make that case against it. Sorry to mansplain, by the way. If you think sex work will destigmatize people selling sex, look at real-life examples in places that have had a legal sex trade and have used sex work language for decades. In New Zealand, Germany, and the Netherlands, there continues to be a sexist double standard of stigma against sex workers, overwhelmingly women, and acceptance of sex buyers, overwhelmingly men. The sex trade is considered legitimate, yet being a sex worker is still met with hatred and discrimination, especially by those who see it as a free choice. You're just saying, like, look at these countries. Oh, my God, it's so bad there. But we don't know. You're not providing any data. You know, I get it. There's still, like, a stigma here in America around, like, we don't have legal prostitution, obviously, but there's, like, strippers and you know, other sex workers like that do that kind of work. And, you know, their careers are often maligned. Their careers are often, you know, looked at with scorn and derision by a lot of people. But, you know, I think that you're one of those people. It seems to me that you hold sex workers in low regard. While pretending that you're fighting for them, you're actually trying to diminish their work and say that they're not really workers. All on the basis of some flimsy garden variety baby's first leftism that could be applied to literally any low-paying shitty job in our economy. But, you know, I do agree with you, though, that people who work in the sex industry are still unfairly maligned and are still regarded in a disparaging way by a lot of people. And I think those people suck. And frankly, I think that, you know, when you create a document like this that continuously seems to remove sex workers from the paradigm of work, and you sort of remove them from the class struggle, you're a piece of shit and you're contributing to the fucking problem. Like, fuck you. You're not a feminist. You're not a feminist. You're anti-woman. You're anti-freedom. You're anti-sex. You're just a prude. You're just another goddamn prude, but you figured out some other ideology that you could sink your teeth into and spin a little web of sophistry to ensnare stupid people. Well, fuck you, I'm on to you. In places with a legal sex trade, most sex workers still hide what they do. Sex workers still lose their day jobs. If outed, sex workers still face assault, theft, and murder by sex buyers and pimps 24/7. While some people in prostitution may feel dignified by the term sex worker and incorrectly believe that stigma is caused solely by policy, language, and legalization won't protect them from violence and animus, ending institutional stigma won't end interpersonal, and community stigma. We can begin to reduce public and self-stigma by sharing factual information about the conditions of the sex trade and by only decriminalizing people selling sex themselves. I mean, we all just know inherently that this is bullshit because there's no way that sex workers are equally likely to get assaulted, murdered, and beaten in a country where it's legal. Violence against prostitutes. Contemporary abolitionism, as described above, is the wrong approach to both prostitution and human trafficking for a number of reasons. First, describing prostitution as violence against women is a one-size-fits-all approach that generalizes prostitution and forces all of its manifestations into one single category. This prevents abolitionism from even conceiving of the many different and complex experiences both sex workers and victims of human trafficking face. Sex workers have many reasons for offering sexual services. True, some might not be happy with sex work, but they may be even less satisfied with other job opportunities that are open to them in their own countries. Similarly, human trafficking may be fueled by migration or labor regimes that make the lives of migrants vulnerable rather than by actual violence. Second, abolitionism does not solve the problem of violence, which more often than not stems from the criminalization of sex workers and migrants and the lack of rights that goes with that. In fact, research has shown that criminalization of sex workers makes them more vulnerable to instances of abuse and exploitation, including human trafficking. So basically, in your article where you're pretending that you're against human trafficking, you're actually for it because the policy you advocate would make it worse. Trying to treat legitimate sex work as though it's tantamount to human trafficking and trying to like blur those lines between the two is really fucking shady and really fucking unfair to people who make their living that way. This fucking othering of sex workers and this dehumanization of sex workers is like some of the most fucked up shit I've ever seen. The term sex worker whitewashes reality. No, it's accurate to reality because that's what they are. They're workers. And centers the least common experience. It is also offensive to many people in prostitution because allows people camming, stripping, and modeling who haven't actually prostituted to speak for those who have. One SWIW advocate has even claimed mothers are sex workers. I think we can all understand who's a sex worker and who isn't. A mother is not a sex worker. I get the logic behind it, by the way. It's pretty absurd, but I get it. A stripper is a sex worker. Yeah, not every form of sex work is prostitution, but prostitution is one of many forms of sex work. There's actors that get paid $20 million, and then there's like the gopher that gets paid, but they're all in the entertainment industry, right? It's just having a fucking shorthand term for an industry. It's not about saying that they all do the same job and have the same identical experience. Like, come on. Let's remember that this American libertarian white woman is the person who coined the term sex work. Her goal was to expand the military prostitution complex. What a fucking terrible argument. This just reminds me of when you hear like one of these weird conservatives or TERFs talk about like, oh man, dude who invented the term gender was a fucking sicko, bro. It's like, I don't care. Who the hell gives a like a lot of people who have invented things in society or who have like, come up with ideas that revolutionize the way we do things are not perfect. A lot of people are fucked up. That doesn't invalidate the idea, you nitwit. So just because the word sex worker was coined by someone you don't like, that's supposed to mean something? Oh, well, she was a libertarian. Oh, no. You disagree with her on some things, therefore you should just disagree with her on everything.
Hey.